It's time to start, so we'd like to start today's webinar. Thank you very much for attending today's webinar, despite being a busy time of end of fiscal year. I am Murata, Sasakawa Peace Foundation, Japan US Group. I will be the moderator for today's webinar. Of the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, the organizer, I'd like to invite Ms. Chano Junko, Executive Director, to give the opening remarks. Good morning. Thank you very much for attending the webinar organized by the Sasakawa Peace Foundation Japan-US program, Japan-Europe Security Cooperation from US Perspectives. The speaker today is Dr. Jeffrey Hornung from the RAND Corporation in the United States, and the commentator is Dr. Michito Tsuruoka from Keio University. We are going to have a discussion about the current status and importance of Japan-Europe securities relationship and relationships between Japan, US, and Europe. Under the new American Biden administration, as you have seen in the US-China foreign ministers' talks in Alaska recently, is showing a tough stance towards China, and it seems that US-China confrontation is being enhanced. But different from previous administration, the administration now is trying to confront China in partnership with the partner countries and the allies. On the other hand, in Europe, in recent years, as you know, there's stronger awareness about security in Asia. Major countries like the UK, France, and Germany are trying to strengthen their relationship with the Indo-Pacific region. Relationship with Japan and the major European countries is also being strengthened, and the distance between Asia and Europe is narrowing. Dr. Hornung's presentation is going to be based on the report Allies Growing Closer, Japan-Europe Security Ties in the Asia Strategic Competition. As I have said, this is a research from the perspective of American researcher on the actual situation and the deepening of the security relationship of Japan and Europe taking place in recent years. He made a proposal of this research, and we found it to be very interesting, so we asked him to do this research. At the time, we didn't expect the expansion of infectious disease of COVID-19, and we are also not aware of the results of the 2020 elections. But we can see that the importance of cooperation and partnership between Europe and Asia is now being strengthened under such an environment. It's a very significant research to understand the current status of cooperation in various securities between the most trusted partners of the United States, which are major European countries and Japan. Dr. Hornung stayed for 1 month as visiting fellow at SPF during this research. And Dr. Tsuruoka and Dr. Hornung, the two of them, are participating in a variety of activities of SPF through the Japan-US program and the Securities Group. I'd like to thank their cooperation to our activities. And please enjoy today's webinar until the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Executive Director Chano. We'd like to go on to the discussion by our two panelists. As was mentioned by Executive Director Chano just earlier, we'll be inviting presentation from Dr. Hornung based on the report related to Japan-European relations, which was published last year. He will include some of the recent updates as well, after which we'd like to invite comments from Dr. Tsuruoka. We will be inviting questions from the audience toward the second half of the session. Allow me to very briefly introduce our two speakers. Dr. Jeffrey Hornung is a leading U.S. researcher who specializes in Japanese security policy. He is a frequent guest on the Japanese media, so I'm sure he's a familiar face to many of you. He was with Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies at Sasakawa, USA, and is currently a political scientist at RAND Corporation, and is very active in various fields. As for our commentator, Dr. Tsuruoka, he is the foremost Japanese expert in terms of European security affairs. He was the special researcher at the Embassy of Japan in Belgium He was a visiting fellow at Royal United Services Institute for Defense and Security Study. He was also a senior research fellow at National Institute for Defense Studies, and he's currently the associate professor for Faculty of Policy Management at Keio University. As for detailed background, please, you'll find them available in the events section of the website for Sasakawa Peace Foundation. So please take a look at that at your leisure. Then, without further ado, we would now like to invite Dr. Jeffrey Hornung to speak. Dr. Hornung, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you so much, Minata-san. Let me begin by thanking Sasakawa Heiwa Zaidan. Always appreciate working with Sasakawa, great organization. And again, thank you, Chano-san and her team, everybody there for sponsoring this research and letting me be a fellow there for a month. What seems like, well, it was years ago, but seems like more than years ago. But thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And thank you all of you for tuning in today to listen to this presentation. If it were kinder times, I'd be there and be giving this in person, but this will have to do. So I'm here today to talk about the report that has already been spoken about, the Allies Growing Closer. And my time here for about the next 15-20 minutes, I want to begin by providing a little understanding of the motivation of the report, give you a simple outline of what the report covers, go into the major findings, and then really focus in on the significance for the United States. And then as we turn to Q&A, I'd be very happy as well to transition more to current events as well. But I'll speak a little bit about those towards the end. So let me begin by talking a little bit about the motivation for why an American would focus on Japanese and European relations. Obviously, some of the United States' most powerful and trustworthy allies are Japan and its European partners. And against a backdrop of Chinese and Russian activities, Japan and Europe have sought new approaches in pursuit of their security. And this is occurring amid changes in how the United States views the security landscape, as well as the roles of its allies and partners. But what is not always fully understood, or at least documented in great detail here in America, are the types of cooperative activities that these allies in Japan and Europe are pursuing in the security domain. And so this report was meant to address that gap. As an American looking at allies in Europe and Japan, I was shocked to not find a lot of information on this. But I must add, and this is a very important point to begin with, my work did not occur in a vacuum or in isolation. It built on the tremendous work done by numerous Japanese and European scholars whose work I admire and who helped me throughout this process. This includes Tsuruoka-san, who's moderating today, Hosoya-san, who's at Keio as well, Goroku-san, and countless number of European scholars, Christopher Hughes, John Nelson Wright, Eva Petsova, Celine Pajon, Louis Simon, Corey Wallace, Mirna Galick, and Paul Midford, and so many others. I just want to mention them because their work, this report would never have been accomplished the way that it has if it wasn't for a lot of the work that these scholars have done. So let me focus now to the outline of the report, basically the contours of what I set out to do in this report. As was already said, the report focuses on the security relationships that Japan is developing with the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and NATO. The objective is not only to detail the wide variety of activities in the security cooperation, but also to understand the motivations behind their cooperation. And importantly, from an American perspective, the report seeks to understand the implications on the relationships the United States has with these countries and NATO. So the analysis focuses largely on three variables. The first variable is defense and strategic dialogues. These are things like discussions and meetings between government officials, mostly civilian. The second variable, it's a bucket of different things: defense exchanges, defense cooperation, and defense-related industrial cooperation. And what I mean by these three things is defense exchanges are things like programs and agreements that allow military officers to visit or study in another country. Things like staff talks or studying at defense universities. The second part of this is defense cooperation. These are things like information security agreements or acquisition and cross-servicing agreements. And then the third is defense-related industrial cooperation. This is collaboration between countries or national defense firms on research or development of military material. And then the third variable is training and exercises between the armed forces of these countries and organization. So this is self-explanatory. It's simply training and exercises. Now, when we look at these four dyads, Japan's relationship with the three countries in NATO, and then we look at those variables that I just examined, the results show the following, and these are very broad overviews of the results. I would ask you to read the report if you want to look in more details. But the Japan-UK security ties are the most robust across all the variables, but they lack an overarching strategy that pulls all the separate lines of effort together into one coherent whole. Now, Japan-France ties, they're across all the variables, they're also very significant, and they're growing. And they do fit well within Japanese and French Indo-Pacific regional strategies. But they lack some of the robust track record that we see in Japan-UK ties. So they have similar variables. They're doing a lot of the similar things, but just not as much as we see in Japan-UK. Bilateral ties between Japan and Germany lack depth. There is a growing convergence around strategic interests that could bring them closer together, but for now, it's very much a work in progress. And finally, Japan's ties with NATO lack dialogues and exchanges, but they are growing their cooperation in various exercises with member countries. Now, as important as these various lines of effort are, I wanted to dig deeper into what are the motivations, what lies behind these efforts. In other words, what's driving Japan and Europe to come together in security cooperation? Now, as many of you know, the primary objective of Japan's foreign policy has been to expand partnerships with states that share its outlook on and concerns about the international system. It is toward this end that Japan has made a dedicated effort to strengthen its alliance with the United States, as well as diversify its strategic partnerships with other countries. Now, Japan does have some unique motivations for each individual case, again, detailed in the report, but there are four common motivations that were found to lie behind Japan's efforts for all four actors. The first is a motivation to protect the rules-based international order. As we see in Tokyo's effort to promote a free and open Indo-Pacific, this should come as no surprise. Japan's leadership acknowledges the need to engage with other partners both in and outside of the region, including European countries, in order to help achieve this. And so for Japan, having different partners strengthens Japan's position in protecting the rules-based international order. The second motivation is to support the United States. The research found that while Tokyo firmly believes US involvement in the region is vital, it has, over the last number of years, seen the United States become more inward-looking. Now, since Japan doesn't believe it alone can keep the United States engaged in an international leadership role, Tokyo sees working with others as a way to help support the United States through burden sharing with like-minded partners. And because European partners are some of Washington's oldest allies, working with them is essentially a no-brainer for Japan. The third motivation is to expand operational knowledge of armed forces and defense-related industrial opportunities. Now, through as many of you are no doubt aware, through the decades of exercises and foreign military sales and some limited joint weapon development projects with the United States, Japan's main reference point for all things defense is really the United States. Yet Tokyo wants to learn from other countries' militaries in order to meet the rapidly changing security challenges. And obviously new partners means new lessons. So this helps the Japanese defense establishment learn new things. And Japanese leadership is also looking for ways to expand the market for Japan's defense industries. The final motivation for Japan is to increase European understanding of Indo-Pacific security challenges. Japan both recognizes the interconnectedness of today's security threats, as well as the fact that it alone is ill-equipped to track and respond to these threats by itself, particularly those that come from outside of Japan's immediate surroundings. Now, there used to be a sense in Tokyo that there was not an appropriate awareness in Europe of the security situation that Japan faces in the region. And so working with these actors fixes this. What's interesting is that Japan's motivations largely correspond with those of the 3 European countries examined, as well as NATO. Well, again, details for each case are in the report, but there are, interestingly, a few overlapping similarities that are worth mentioning here. So again, these are just broad brushstrokes, but like Japan, all 4 European actors examined are motivated to have closer security ties out of a desire to protect the rules-based international order against today's challenges, as well as protecting multilateralism. Similarly, Japan and all 4 European actors in the report view the United States as an important strategic ally. There are no indications that any of these actors want to replace the United States or change the role that it plays. And so stronger security ties with another US ally are seen as a way to bolster one's bilateral strategic relationship with the United States, which not only reinforces, but also complements the United States alliance system. Likewise, all 4 are motivated by variations of a similar concern to protect their regional interests or security concerns. It's essentially, there's a growing understanding of the interconnectedness today of the Indo-Pacific and Europe, and that this has led in turn to all actors looking outside of their region to other capable actors. And then finally, although I didn't mention it above, all 4 European actors, like Japan, are motivated by an increasing concern regarding China. Now, Japan has long been cautious of China. European governments at NATO have not always shared that view. Instead, they've tended to highlight the gains from economic trade. Today, though, Europeans' position is less focused on prioritizing economic ties and more balanced to include greater cautiousness with respect to Chinese investments and greater criticism of Chinese behavior. Now, that said, there are 2 main differences that I found in the course of this research when it comes to Japan and Europe coming together. The first one is, in fact, China. Despite all these actors coalescing around a view that China poses a threat or a challenge to the international order, they don't always agree on the way to deal with China. What I found was that European actors generally want to maintain constructive relations with China. And so this has moderated their approach to China, traditionally meaning that they've refrained from explicitly naming and shaming China, for instance, as a threat. That is changing. Still, what I found is that most Europeans, when I was in the capitals researching this and talked to officials, they tend to find Japan's approach to sometimes be too confrontational in its willingness to name and shame China or actively try to counter Chinese influence. But there's another diverging point, and that exists with Russia. Whereas the UK, France, Germany, and NATO all view Russia as a serious violator of international laws and norms, and as their greatest threat that demands attention, there was a discrepancy in that they did not feel Japan views Moscow that way. And again, this research was done during the during the Abe administration, when the Abe administration was trying to get a peace treaty and get the return of the 4 northern territories. And so that had something to do with it. But from a European perspective, Japan's lack of committed interest in countering the Russian threat appears to contradict its call to rally behind support for the international order. So those are the major findings. Now, let me turn next to really what motivated it in this research in the first place, and that's the significance to the United States. Excuse me. So as important as these findings are, and they show the breadth and the depth of ways that Japan and these 4 European actors are cooperating, it is important to know why the United States should care about this, why the United States should take note. Now, before I detail a number of specific areas where these growing security ties help the United States, I think it's safe to say in broad terms that these actors are building closer relationships that benefit US strategy. These relationships augment the US bilateral relationships and the US alliance system. It's important to note that they do not limit US policy options. They actually expand them. And as the Biden administration, for instance, in its interim security strategy that it released, it called America's allies its greatest strategic asset. And so this logic, I believe, continues, and the findings are therefore very relevant even today. Now, as I detail in the report, Japan, NATO, and the 3 European states are doing many of the same things that the United States is doing with these same allies. As a result, I argue that the growing security ties among these allies are very important for the United States. So let me just go over 6 specific areas here that why it's significant for the United States for what these Japan and Europe are doing together. The first is that these partnerships support US leadership. So cooperation between Japan and key European states and NATO supports US international leadership role. Despite a perception that the United States gave up some of its leadership standing during the Trump years, the US allies reviewed in this report are not interested in walking away from the United States. Rather, their efforts strengthen the US role in world affairs, since having networked allies willing to work together and support the United States is actually critical to sustaining US leadership at a time of increasing strategic competition. The second reason that this is important is that their cooperation supports international burden sharing. Having like-minded partners with which to work is important to the US from this burden sharing perspective, and in a number of different ways. For instance, more partners doing similar things helps the United States send stronger signals that when it criticizes China, for example, that this is a broad-based international coalition of states in support of its actions. It's not just the United States. Allied operational efforts could also eventually free up US naval assets if Japan and European states ever conduct patrols to demonstrate freedom of navigation or monitor illegal ship-to-ship transfers. Now, realistically, these efforts are likely to remain insignificant for the foreseeable future, but eventually, if this is done, it does help reduce the need for US naval assets to do the same types of operations. And then finally, one more example of how this supports burden sharing. Having a broader set of like-minded partners that work together helps the United States diversify how it can apply pressure. The United States and its allies that are reviewed in this report, they have different strengths. They can divide roles and missions and different resources that they can draw on. So the third way that this is significant for the United States is that cooperation supports flexible, smaller groupings of partnerships for the United States to leverage for different issues. So the more that the US becomes comfortable working with, US allies become comfortable working with one another in different regions on different issues, there are going to be increased opportunities for the United States to create more flexible arrangements. The Quad has been in the news a lot lately. That is a flexible arrangement of 4 states. Having these different European and Japan work together, European states and Japan work together, this creates more flexible arrangements like other trilaterals or quadrilaterals that the allies can draw on different strengths or relations with countries in their specific regions. The fourth way this is significant is that their cooperation makes US allies more effective. They help make each other more effective. I mean, this is just simply increasing touch points among defense and military counterparts, such as through exercises or defense exchanges. This helps allies learn from each other. You know, they learn how to conduct threat assessments differently. They learn how to deploy and operate different weapon systems. They exchange information on issues. And as exercises become more robust and take on greater operational significance, these allies may even become operationally interoperable. And so this positions them to help maintain stability and ensure free access to the global commons. Now, there's a lot of work to do. This isn't going to happen tomorrow. But the important thing is that if Japan, the 3 European states, and NATO, if they ever want to do anything operational in the future, they have to start somewhere. And so we see that happening right now. The fifth is that, and this is very unique to Japan, or at least I focused this one on Japan, their cooperation helps strengthen Japan without using US resources. Now, what I mean by that is that the US has long wanted Japan to do more for its defense and for regional security. And so growing security ties with other US allies is actually productive in helping support Japan to become more strategically inclined beyond its immediate region. And it also helps build critical knowledge for the Jietai and for defense policies by learning from different partners. And then finally, the last area that this is significant, and then I'll finish up here, it's cooperation among allies connects the regions. The United States, as all of you know, it's a global power and has vested interests in both Europe and the Indo-Pacific. And so having like-minded allies in these regions get closer and play more active role, particularly in the Indo-Pacific where there's a lot of activity now, it helps build a more closely networked set of partners performing security cooperation. And so this helps make US allies more aware about other regions as well as the interconnection between their own. And having its allies better understand issues with which the US is engaged makes them better allies because they can better understand the US pressures and US interests and US concerns and support the US if possible. Now, let me close with one thought about the Biden administration, and I'm happy to talk more about this in Q&A. Although the research for this report was completed in December 2019, the findings are still pertinent today, and the broad trends described in this report have not changed. As the recent meetings there in Tokyo, as well as in Anchorage, Alaska, demonstrate, the United States recognizes China as posing a challenge to the region. And as the Quad meeting shows, the United States recognizes it cannot sustain a free and open Indo-Pacific by itself. Now, the Biden administration is prioritizing the need to work with friends and allies. And having European allies and Japan work closer together, especially in the security domain, supports this effort, as the United States looks to cooperate with like-minded allies and partners to address common challenges. So with that, let me stop there and turn it over to Tsuruoka-san.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hornung. Then we now like to go on to the comment to be made by Dr. Tsuruoka. Dr. Tsuruoka, could we have your comment about the report just made by Dr. Hornung, and also share with us your question as well? The floor is yours, Dr. Tsuruoka. Yes, thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for your kind invitation. I'm very grateful. So I read the report by Dr. Hornung. I read this with a great interest. Now, when I first heard about this project, I found it very interesting. An American like Dr. Hornung, American researcher, was doing research into the security cooperation between Japan and Europe. This is a very serious effort, and I was very interested by this point. Now, when it comes to security cooperation between Japan and Europe, why is this important? It's important for the significance for Japan, significance for the Europeans, and significance for the Americans. You covered all these axes. And I totally agree with what Dr. Hornung mentioned. Thank you so much for this very robust summary of your research. Now, as for myself, since I'm a commentator and a discussant, I've been given 10 minutes. I would like to focus primarily on the Japanese perspective in my comment, and also I would like to direct some questions to you as well. Let me start with my comment. For Japan, the significance of Japan-European security cooperation. As far as I see it, for Japan, I think there's still a sense of skepticism skepticism prevailing on the Japanese side. For Japanese security, Japan-US alliance is, of course, first and foremost. So from that perspective, just because Europeans are now playing a certain role, in essence, it's not that much, according to the skepticism. And Europe cannot substitute the United States. In terms of emergency, Europeans probably cannot be that relied upon. I frequently hear such views. So there are skeptics vis-a-vis Japan-European cooperation, and these are very typical skeptics' views. But then, I believe the whole perspective of these critics are wrong. Not being able to take the place of the U.S. or not being able to fight in terms of emergency, that might be a fact. But then, from the beginning, we're not looking to replace Japan-U.S. alliance through Japan-European cooperation. We're not trying to do that. So I think the whole structure is different, is wrong. I say wrong. The Japanese and the Europeans, what are they looking for in the security cooperation? I don't think they provide very straightforward, clear-cut explanations about the motive and the intentions behind the cooperation. So that is why some people view that this might be an effort to replace U.S.-Japan alliance, but then that cannot be viable. So I think it's important that we send out strong, clear-cut message. This applies to both Japanese and Europeans. That's one homework that both sides have. We need to put out a more clear-cut message. There's a diversification is the word diversification is the word frequently used when people talk about Japanese and European security cooperation. Now, in your work, you don't casually use the term diversification, only in certain sections. But I think, but on a different context, you don't casually use the word diversification in your report. You also use the word additional layer. It's not diversification. It's U.S.-Japan Security Alliance is the foundation, and on top or on side in addition to U.S.-Japan Security Alliance, a different layer is being added. If that can be done, then for Japan, that would be strategically beneficial. So the term diversification might connote the image that we're trying to replace U.S.-Japan Security Alliance. I think it's important that we put that misconception aside. It's something on top of U.S.-Japan Security Alliance. How can we utilize and leverage Europeans on top of U.S.-Japan Security Alliance? And from that perspective, I have one other comment. At the end of the day, this applies to the U.S. as well, but when we take a look at the European security role in Asia, what do we expect from the Europeans in the security in Asia? I don't think that is clear strategically. So even within the United States, if the Europeans are to dispatch vessels to Asia, for example, I think some Americans would see that as a waste. I think some Americans would simply want the Europeans to play a robust role within Europe. I think for U.S., some view that strategically it makes sense for Europeans to play a robust role in Europe in order to alleviate the burden on the part of U.S. and Europe. So play division roles. If the partners play their roles in respective regions, then Americans could play a more effective role. That view is prevailing. But then that argument is also problematic. Because it would translate into a perception that the Americans are not going to work together with other partners when it comes to China. So that would be problematic. Then if that is the case, then specifically, if the European vessels are to come to Asia, what are we going to expect from the Europeans?
There's no clear message about it from the government. And also in Japan, this year, there will be an aircraft carrier from the UK. So we are going to have a lot of events, but with a French ship or a German ship or a British aircraft carrier, when coming to Japan, what are we trying to realize strategically by using this opportunity? UK or France, how are they planning to use Japan? from different perspective. There must be a clear strategy about it. Otherwise, though there are so many opportunities, Japan will not be able to make efficient, effective use of such opportunities. In case of exercise, there are many proposals about exercise from UK or France, but I don't know why, but Japan is very reactive. There are proposals, so let us think about it and answer. So there is no coherent strategy. So it's a waste. I feel very regrettable. And there's another point I'd like to mention that for Japan, when there are European ships coming to Japan, plug in is an important concept that you have to use. How to plug in the US-Japan alliance, not only Japan, but for instance, Australia, then US-Australia alliance. How will UK or France be plugged in into that alliance? Then Japan, US, Australia cooperation, how will Europe be plugged in? As I have mentioned, and as you have mentioned, additional layer should be the access. Thinking from that perspective, at least in the military perspective, I think we can have a more clear picture about the role of Europe. And on top of that, there are two brief questions that I'd like to ask. As you mentioned in your report, Japan is naming and shaming China's threat. And from your perspective, it may be too confrontational. I think you heard about it through your interviews and it's written in your report. Depending on the sector, maybe these may be changing. For instance, the sanctions to wiggle China rather than Japan, Europe is emphasizing more. And Japan has a stronger position towards China rather than Europe. This relationship may be changing depending on the sector. Then, how will this impact the cooperation between Europe and Japan? And another point, West Pacific is of course important, but the European presence or European capability, from that perspective, is Indo-Pacific Ocean or the Arabian Sea. That may be another area that we should focus. So next month, Quad plus France, the 5 countries are going to have a joint exercise. It's the western side of the Indo-Pacific area. So in that area, that may be more interesting in terms of cooperation with Europe, and compared to West Pacific, presence of the US is less in this area. So maybe there's something we can do more. And from American perspective, cooperation with Europe in the Indo-Pacific Ocean may be another perspective that we should think about. So those are my 2 questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tsuruoka. So you gave us a comment from the Japanese perspective, and you also shared with us 2 questions at the end. Japan was more critical of China up until now, but depending on areas, that these things may be changing. That's what you pointed out in your first question. What significance this will have on Japanese-European cooperation going forward? And the second point is in relation to the Indo-Pacific. So Dr. Hornung, would you like to respond to these 2 questions first? So Dr. Hornung, would you like to respond,
Yes.
please? Thank you.
Yes. Thank you. Great comments, Tsuruoka-san, and thank you as well for these questions. Let me begin by, you mentioned about the skeptics, and I can tell you that there's many times that I talk about when this research came out, there were quite a few Americans that said, well, there's really not a lot of interesting stuff there. And because they can't do anything, or what is Europe going to do in the Indo-Pacific? But as you rightly put, I think the skeptics, I think it depends on how they frame the question. If people approach this idea and think that Europe sending ships to the Indo-Pacific equals Europe being willing to fight for the Senkaku Islands or something like that, I think that's where they're going to be disappointed. Because it's not about necessarily the war fighting elements of cooperation. It's more about these other elements that happen in peacetime in terms of learning different skills or learning or, industrial cooperation. But there is a peacetime element of competition. And having, as I mentioned in my talk, having more states say the same message and show that it's not just the United States pushing or criticizing China for something, but it is a broad array of states that are doing it. I think that in itself has value. But let me stop there and get to your questions. Your first point, very well taken. As I mentioned, this report was, I finalized the research for this in December 2019. And, just looking at how much the world has changed since this report went into formatting and editing and all that. Yes, Europe is changing. I saw this Pew Research Center poll back in the fall. I believe it was October or November. I should have wrote the date down. I wrote the statistic down, but not the date. But it showed that more than 70% of people in the UK, France, and Germany have negative views of China. So this is a tremendous amount of people in these countries that are holding negative views of China. And so this, of course, is going to provide support to the governments of these countries taking more, firmer stance against China. But your question is, how is this going to impact cooperation? It's going to impact cooperation in a positive way. We're going to see European countries more willing and reaching out and more forward-leaning to cooperate with Japan. And, as we've seen rumors already, and I'm sure we're going to see more in the coming weeks about states seeing if they could be part of a Quad Plus. This is sort of the new organization that has a lot of, it's popular right now. So it is going to lead to more cooperation. And I think that's already evident in what we see in terms of just ship movements here. You already mentioned about the United Kingdom. Obviously, the UK plans to dispatch its HMS Queen Elizabeth to the Indo-Pacific by the end of the year. Germany is expected to send 1 frigate. France revealed that it sent a nuclear-powered attack sub to the South China Sea. We see more activity. Now, this is not going to balance China. This is not going to stop China, but it is signaling, it is messaging, which is important in and of itself. So the second question is about, if I understood the question correctly, is instead of maybe the West Pacific, maybe we need to focus more on the Indian Ocean or sort of that part of the Indo-Pacific where the US is less present. I think there's real value to that. If we think about back during the war in Afghanistan and the fact of how active NATO was, it was we saw the operations of NATO members active in the Afghanistan conflict, Japan as well active. There was some overlap there even with NATO member states. And as you mentioned, the US presence is not as substantial in that part of the Indo-Pacific. It's much more substantial in the West Pacific and Japan, East China Sea area. And so I think there is value. And as we go forward and we start to ask this question that you asked about, what do we want from Europe? What does the United States want Europe in the Indo-Pacific? What does Japan want from Europe in the Indo-Pacific? As well as at some point, I'm sure we're going to be asking, what do the Quad states want from the European states? I think there's going to be a lot more questions for the foreseeable future. I don't have an answer to that. But I think it seems that a lot of states, including Japan and sometimes even the United States, the simple answer is more presence. I'm not necessarily convinced that that's the answer, but it seems to be the easy answer right now. But let me stop there.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Hornung. Dr. Tsuruoka, do you have any reaction to the answer by Dr. Hornung or any additional comments? Yes, many countries are flexible, taking different formats to cooperate. And actually, this is already taking place, and I think this format will become more important. So Quad have sometimes France participating or the UK participating from time to time, or Australia, Japan, US, Australia, or within Quad. How should Australia be more engaged? So the homework for Japan is that in the Indian Ocean, how much Japan is prepared to participate or be engaged in the Indian Ocean. That is also important. Of course, West Pacific is important. But when we talk about Quad in Indo-Pacific, the Indian Ocean is as important as the Western Pacific. So for Australia, Indian Ocean is very important. So anti-piracy activities, and more than that, how much can Japan be engaged? That is a question that Japan must consider. Thank you very much. We also have received questions from the participants. So let me introduce some of the questions. First, one of the major reasons the United States participating in the security between Japan and Europe, economy may be a major reason. China and Russia, that is a hybrid threat, and to respond to such threat, sanctions, including trade and finances importance, and also to enhance resilience of a country's cooperation among the allies is important. So what do you think of that? Economy, trade, finance included, cooperation in this area. That is the question being asked. Dr. Hornung, could you please answer?
Sure. I mean, from a strategic standpoint, when the United States looks at a security challenge, for instance, like China, it will be looking at, I think it's better postured when it uses all the tools in its foreign policy toolkit to respond. And so diplomacy should always be first. I think we see diplomacy back in the center of US foreign policy now. But there should always be other means, not military means. Finance and economic are those. The European and the United States tends to rely on things like sanctions more than states like Japan does. It's different ways, and I'm not here to say that that's right or wrong. It's just that traditionally Japan has relied on sanctions less. The United States has relied on sanctions more. That's a fact. And so I think going forward, and this is where partnerships matter, because states do different things. We have different relationships. We have different tools that we're willing to use to respond to challenges. And the more that we can have groups working together, we can have a more comprehensive response to security challenges.
ありがとうございます。鶴岡先生、いかがでしょうか。この経済とか技術とかですね、先端技術、振興技術。
Dr. Tsuruoka, would you like to respond? Yes. When we think of technology and advanced technology involving Europeans, I think that is important. There's increasing need to involve the Europeans. This applies to G7, Tech 10, whatever. It's important that it's important that we invite US, Korea, and all these countries together to counter China. And one other point, when it comes to TPP, when the Obama administration launched this initiative, they had the intention to create rules in order to create rules to counter China. I think Secretary Panetta, he mentioned that TPP is as robust as a carrier. It's probably more important than one carrier, I would imagine. I hope that, but this might be difficult under the Biden government, but TPP is one important pillar. I just wanted to say that. Thank you.
That's right. That's right.
Thank you very much. Yes, we have received many questions through the Q&A. A question about Germany. So let me read this question. It's in English, so I will read out the English version.
How will Germany contribute to the security in the Pacific in a concrete manner without any military bases and territories there?
Germany, as a chair country of the EU, pushed EU to conclude the investment agreement with China last December in spite of the coming Biden administration's negative stance. And she will recognize China as her most important market.
So, Dr. Hornung, would you like to respond to this question, please?
Yeah. So I have to admit that from the time I finished research on this report to now, out of all the areas that I researched, the one that has changed the most is Germany. September 2020, they released their Indo-Pacific policy guidelines that underscore its intention to increase engagement with Asia. This is the second European country after France to do that. They finally negotiated and signed an intel sharing agreement this month, and they've also planned a dispatch of a frigate. Now, all that being said, as much change as we see, Germany's security role in the Indo-Pacific is still very minimal. If we look at the Indo-Pacific policy guidelines, for instance, it recognizes that the Indo-Pacific region is becoming key to shaping the international order, wants to be an active contributor to shaping that order, but by and large, those guidelines largely focus on things like multilateralism, economic relations, international law, climate, cultural, education. It doesn't focus on security as much. Now, things like exercises, security forums, though they're in there, but it's not the focus. And so when I look at that and I see, even though Germany's doing some things, I'm still not convinced that Germany has a large role to play when its economics is still front and center.
Thank you. Same question, Dr. Tsuruoka. Would you like to respond? Yes, Germany is changing. Yes, that is one important point. Germany is changing. So that is why the dispatch of frigate to Asia by the Germans, that Germany were to dispatch vessel, that was quite impactful and surprising. But on the other hand, for Germany's economy, China is so important. So I think we need to, so they want to maintain that. But then in Japan, I think we have the view that Germany is only focused on on the economic correction. That is not the case. Actually, when it comes to economy for Japan is more interdependent on China. So I think we need to call spade a spade, because Japan is in a similar position. Japan shares similar issues. How do you maintain economic relationship at the same time when it comes to when it comes to security relations, take a robust position? How to balance that? It's not just Japan and Germany. It applies to US as well as to other European countries as well, I believe.
Thank you very much. Now, I would like to move on to the next question. To raise the level of pod and plug-in, as Dr. Tsuruoka mentioned, to raise Quad's level and plug in Europe, on the assumption that I agree with that, I have a question. And the first point, as a quasi-ally, I think there's a higher risk of being involved in events or incidences. So how to strike a balance? Do you have any hints about that? That's the first question. And number two, in strengthening cooperation with Europe, what are the bottlenecks in doing so, if there's any bottleneck? So that is the question. So, Dr. Tsuruoka, could you please start? Yes, thank you. To be involved accidentally, that is an important issue, but we cannot reach a total solution. We don't want to be involved in problems of others. That is all human beings think, but alliance is a framework to show our determination, be prepared to be involved. If we have a trouble, you have to help others. So to deny such involvement of relationship, then that will not lead to establishment of a alliance, and Quad is not an alliance, but it is a very loose relationship. But unless we are prepared to be involved, I don't think we can reach anything in substance. And I think that is something that we Japanese must think about. Of course, we don't want to be involved in some others' troubles, but the point is, how are we determined and prepared to do so? And to be involved could also be of our benefit. How to establish that understanding is important. Something happening in the ocean is far from Japan in terms of Quad. Why must Japan be engaged in the ocean? How much benefit is there for Japan? The point is how we can establish that understanding and have other understandings about it. Thank you very much, Dr. Tsuruoka. So, to be an alliance, how are we determined to participate in the alliance? And how much benefit is there for us? That is something that we must be aware of. Now, from an American perspective, what are your views, Dr. Hornung?
Yeah, I agree fully with Tsuruoka-san on that last point. It is natural to feel like you don't want to be involved, but it's also natural that if something happens to you, if your house is on fire, you want your neighbors to come help you put your fire out. And so as much as there may be a tendency, for instance, in Japan, of some that feel that getting involved in the Quad means that Japan could get sucked into conflicts or challenges elsewhere, I would ask to turn that around. And if Japan is in a conflict or in a problem and needs help, I'm sure there would be a desire to have other states help Japan. Speaking from an alliance standpoint, the US-Japan alliance, I know it doesn't get explicitly said as such in Japan as much, but it is a war-fighting relationship. That is what an alliance is, where the United States has promised to defend Japan. And so here is a situation where the United States will get involved if something happens to Japan. I don't think the Quad is of that caliber right now. And I don't know if the questioner was insinuating that, should we think about the Quad with Europe? My own personal belief is that it's way too early to expand the Quad and think about Quad Plus, because it's still very much in the early days and there's a lot that needs to be done. The second question about bottlenecks, I think, is a very important one. It is something that came up in the course of research. In terms of, maybe I don't use the word bottleneck, but in terms of challenges of having Europe more involved in the Indo-Pacific, there are quite a number of them. One is resources. It costs a lot of money and manpower to send ships all the way from Europe to the Indo-Pacific. One frigate costs Germany a lot of money and manpower to get that frigate over to the Indo-Pacific. And that's the second one. A second bottleneck is distance. Whereas it's very easy for US-Japan to exercise together with US forces there in Japan, that's not easy for having Japanese and British soldiers exercise together. One has to make a long journey. That's very long. And then the last one is just lack of resources, not just finances, but also just you think about the capabilities, having the ships, having the helicopters, having the ability to transfer from point A to point B. Germany, for instance, it's rebuilding its military, and so there are a lot of issues there. I'll stop.
ありがとうございました。まだまだたくさんのご質問をいただいております。
Thank you very much. We have so many questions, but I'm afraid our time has run out. So one last question. Let me try to lump them together. So please choose among these questions which you want to respond to. I'll just read out the questions. So I would like to invite one final comment from the commentators after reading out some of the questions. So please choose any one of these questions. So first, knowledge about Asia. I think historically, countries like, historically, European countries have more knowledge about Asia than US. So it would meaningfully leverage the knowledge of the Europeans on Asia That's the first point. And the second, this is about the role of ASEAN. It's in English. Let me read out.
ASEAN lies geographically between Japan and Europe. Any thoughts on the role of ASEAN amid Japan-Europe security cooperation? というところでございます。そして、もう一つ
That's
で
the
すね
second question. And the final question.
日本、先ほど
Earlier, Dr. Tsuruoka talked about the skeptics that were there when it comes to Japan-European security cooperation. But likewise, aren't there skeptics in both Europe as well as in the United States about this cooperation as well? In particular, in the United States, there is increasing number of so-called Atlantist experts who want to see increasing involvement in NATO in the context of China. So how much interest is there among these people when it comes to cooperation between Japan and Europe and Japan-US-European cooperation in Indo-Pacific? So these are the questions. Please choose among any of them. So I would like to invite both of you to respond and receive a comment from you, and then conclude the webinar. So Dr. Hornung, would you like to respond to this question, please? Thank you.
Yes. Very quick. The ASEAN role, yes. I mean, given that a lot of these states are transiting the South China Sea and active going back and forth, and basically that's the crucible of where challenges occur, ASEAN needs to play a role, but maybe not there needs to be a lot more coordination and cooperation with ASEAN. I'm not talking about security cooperation like we see with Japan, but there needs to be more collaboration. And then I'll just quickly, the skeptics in the US, yes. There are skeptics in the US about Japan, Europe, in the Indo-Pacific. Totally agree with that point. And that's one of the motivations behind this report. So I'll end there, and I want to thank Sasakawa again for this great opportunity and for the chance to have this report. Thank you.
ありがとうございます。では、鶴岡先生、お願いいたします。
Thank you very much, Dr. Tsuruoka. Then let me answer the questions that Dr. Hornung did not answer about Europe. For instance, the UK, SPDA, there is a 5 countries agreement arrangement. Or in case of France, they have territory in Asia. So there are such connections leading to commitment or engagement, which I think will continue to be important. And in addition to that, Quad, for example, or Quad Plus, the UK has a special relationship with Australia and New Zealand. So how to use that relationship? They are a Commonwealth, or they call it Anglo-Saxon or Five Eyes. So the role of UK in the region, I think, exists somewhere in this region. And the last point I'd like to mention. Today, we're talking about Japan-Europe cooperation, but as you can see, the United States is always strongly engaged, strongly related. So this is a point that I wanted to emphasize. As I mentioned at the outset, the skeptics in Japan, in terms of Japan, Europe, they have images that we are trying to do something only between Japan and Europe. But actually, the United States is totally engaged. For instance, the UK carrier is going to come, but that's a sort of joint carrier between US and UK and have a joint exercise. With Japan is a Japan, US, UK exercise, and also a French submarine came to this region last year, and that is a cooperation with the US that was exercised jointly with the US and the US Navy in ships coming from the European countries into the Pacific. The US Navy provides a very strong support. So that's actually happening in reality. So when we think about Japan-Europe relationship, we should not forget that US is always related. And when there's a joint exercise with a European country, in many cases, Americans also participate. So thinking from that perspective, when we look at Japan-European cooperation, I think you can have a different image about this relationship. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity today.
Dr. Hornung, Dr. Tsuruoka, Thank you so much for your contribution. And thank you for responding to the many questions that we received. We could not exhaust all the questions, unfortunately. There are some questions that are left. Our apologies to those of you who asked those questions. Now, the basis of the discussion today, the report entitled Allies Growing Closer. I hope you can see it. Japan-Europe security ties in the age of strategic competition. Yeah, thank you so much. This report will be available on our website. You'll be able to download for free of charge. And you'll be able to find the Japanese summary as well. So please, if you're interested, please take a look at it. Dr. Hornung talked about the 6 implications for the US. These are covered in the conclusion part of the report. So if you're interested, we hope that you will take a look at the actual report at your leisure. Once again, we'd like to thank Dr. Hornung and Dr. Tsuruoka for their valuable contribution. We really appreciate your participation. We'd like to conclude this webinar. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.